As I said last time, one of the most universal emotions that couples in crisis face is anger. And I think especially for the betrayed spouse, anger is probably one of the first and one of the most overpowering emotions that they feel initially in recovery. I've asked Samantha to come in very soon and talk about her own anger because many of you posted question upon question upon question about how do you deal with the anger and how do you get through the anger. And so she'll be coming in to address that. In the meantime, I want to give you some tools on what helps Samantha and what has helped thousands of other betrayed spouses really work through their anger. You know, anger is very situational. I mean, for some betrayed spouses, their anger is actually something that needs to be corralled, worked through, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And we have to help them not torture their spouse and not transmit their pain. But for some betrayed spouses, they need to get angry. Some need to diffuse their anger, and some need to actually get angry and stand up for themselves and begin to really pursue their own self-respect and their own dignity in a situation where maybe they've been codependent, or maybe they've been a doormat, or maybe they have just really lost their sense of self. And so there is a point where I do tell some spouses, look, you're being walked over and you are allowing it out of a fear of rejection or codependency or this or that. So there is a time when the betrayed actually should get angry and really begin to stand up for themselves. And then there's another situation where maybe their anger has to be really processed and ultimately diffused if they're going to begin to gain ground in both their own recovery and the potential recovery of their marriage. I think inherently, anger isn't necessarily bad, especially when you're dealing with infidelity, because infidelity has a way of affecting every area of your life. Your child rearing, your finances, your marital life, obviously, but your job, your health, your family relationships. I mean, you name it, infidelity is quite nuclear in that it just basically wants to stick its effects and consequences and collateral damage into every area of your life. Anger becomes destructive, and anger, I think, begins to actually start to cut the legs out from underneath you when it's destructive to you or when it's destructive to the lives of those around you. When you begin to transmit that anger and you begin to torture your unfaithful spouse or sometimes your kids or other relationships, at that point I think you have to sit back and go, man, I've got a problem and I've got to address it because it's now bringing destruction to both my own life and everyone around me. When many of you saw Samantha, you kind of thought, man, you know, where's the anger and all of that? And we are several years removed. But I will tell you initially, Samantha, while she's never really been an angry person when she was young or even adolescent, teenage, young adult years, she was very angry early on. When she told the story of how she broke things, like it was a major scene. Like it was one of those scenes where you're like, nothing to see here, kids. Let's go in the front yard. Let's get in the car and go for a drive. I mean, she had gloves and a giant pickaxe in her hand, and she was destroying this wood playhouse to the point where neighbors actually were kind of peeking over our backyard wall. Yes, she hit me a couple of times and pretty hard, but those were isolated experiences. They were not the totality of her recovery even early on, but she had some significant bouts of anger, and I'm sure if you're a betrayed spouse, you have as well, and it's really perfectly normal. The first couple weeks of Samantha's anger, she went through what I think is the initial stage for many, which is just really feeling the anger. Your whole world has been turned upside down. You are completely in shock and awe, and your initial response is to lash out. And so she was really feeling the anger. This wasn't something that was normal to her. It wasn't something that she had been in touch with her entire life, really. She was not an angry person and wasn't very skilled at her anger. So when the anger hit, it was like a nuclear meltdown. So those first couple of weeks, and for some spouses it might be longer, for some spouses it may be a little bit shorter, certainly, but for her, she had to feel the anger, get in touch with the anger, and begin to realize that she was angry and that it was okay that she was so angry. The next phase, I think, is a very common next step for many, which is processing and identifying the anger. Processing meaning, what am I angry about? Why am I so angry? You know, if anger is typically a secondary emotion, what are the primary emotions that I'm feeling? She would journal. I mean, she still has a lot of these old journals. I'm talking 20 or 30 journals that she would write in and she would process. And I read them sometimes, which was a huge mistake. And I was reading what she was feeling in a moment, not what she was feeling over the entirety of the recovery process, or even that week. It was just a bad hour. But nevertheless, she was identifying and processing. And you too, if you're a betrayed spouse, you're going to have to go through a significant season where you process and identify. For her, it was a good few months of coming to grips with why was she so angry. And that meant piecing together details and realizing that when I said I was here, I was actually there, and really coming to grips in a very proactive way with the support of Rick and the team in an EMS weekend. She was processing and identifying why she was angry, what really had been tapped into. Were there other sources of trauma and childhood origin issues, which there were, that were all wrapped up in the anger that she was trying to process through and identify. Now, this process and identify stage is not paralysis. It's very proactive. It's lots of writing. It's lots of professional work. It's maybe like on the website you'll see Harboring Hope for Betrayed Spouses. It's a fantastic place to process and identify. This wasn't just sitting around being angry. This was trying to gain ground, and some of you may not be able to do much recovery work because of finances, but you can still journal, you can still process, you can still identify, you can still be proactive. You don't have to remain a victim, and you don't have to remain stuck in the anger that you're feeling. The final stage was the stage that I like to call uprooting and dealing with anger. Another way to say it is she was working the anger. This was the most proactive stage. She was forgiving, she was letting go, she was identifying resentment, and then she was forgiving that person. She was forgiving the affair partner. She was forgiving me. She was forgiving the people that forsook us in the midst of the worst pain we'd ever felt. Now, at this point, you might say, oh my gosh, she's forgiving, she's disempowering herself. No, no, no. She was empowering herself because she was letting go of the things that were tormenting her and torturing her. She was breaking free of resentment and bitterness and rage. She was forgiving because forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself. She was letting go of resentment and anger because being able to let go of resentment is a gift you give yourself. She was doing recovery work. She was working the anger. She was taking her life back from the anger that she was, in many ways, imprisoned to early on. When she was working the anger, that was with Rick's help, that was even with my help. She even saw someone who specialized in dealing with trauma. She was able to work the anger because she was not going to sit back and just remain angry. She was willing to do recovery work. She had to have some very tough conversations with me, with Rick, with the trauma specialist, because she wanted to work the anger to get her life back. Part of taking your life back is forgiving. Forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself. Letting go of resentment is a gift that you give yourself. It's the ability to say, I'm not going to remain stuck. I'm not going to be a slave to the anger, the trauma, the hurt, the pain. I am not going to stay paralyzed by what I've had to experience and what's made me so angry. Now, I want to throw out a caveat to you. If you are someone who is feeling like you're dealing with PTSD, if you are even dealing with short-term PTSD, and you feel like your reactions are at some level beyond your control, you may be dealing with a short-term PTSD, and you're going to need to get some help that is very specific to PTSD care. That's something called EMDR. You can Google it. You can hopefully find a specialist in your area. It's not for everybody. But if you feel like you're dealing with PTSD, you're not going to be able to approach it with just a generic three-step process that I've identified. You're going to need a deeper level of care that EMDR will help you with. It will help you do some work. It's specifically for trauma victims. War veterans utilize it as well. It is a lifesaver, and many women and many men will testify that EMDR was one of the best things that they ever did for their trauma that they were processing.